She confronted him in front of the whole class, expecting an easy victory. But the more she challenged him, the more she realized she had chosen the wrong adversary. The lecture hall at Berkeley College of Political Science buzzed with soft conversation as students arrived and settled into their seats. The room exuded prestige, high ceilings, walls lined with bookshelves, and a podium that had hosted decades of passionate debates. Dr. Rebecca Langley, a tenured professor famed for her sharp intellect and progressive views, tapped her pen against the wooden podium, scanning the room with the assuredness of someone who had triumphed in countless intellectual confrontations. She had earned her reputation by deconstructing conservative viewpoints and transforming discussions into public lessons on social justice and in economic equality. But today her focus was on a new challenge. At the back of the room, Barron Trump, the youngest son of the former president, sat with an air of quiet self-assurance. His presence in her class had sparked whispers since the first day of the semester. Students speculated about why he was there. Was he trying to reshape his image? Was he another privileged heir just gliding through life? Or did he genuinely care about political science? Dr. Langley had been observing him, waiting for the right moment. Unlike most students who shied away from her probing questions, Barron didn't retreat. He listened, took notes, and occasionally smirked when she made what she considered irrefutable points. That smirk was enough to spur her into action. She set her lecture notes aside and leaned forward, her voice cutting through the chatter. Before we dive into today's topic on economic policy, let's address something interesting, she said, her tone measured but carrying a hint of condescension. Mr. Trump, you've been rather quiet in class. I'm sure you have opinions. Why don't you share them with us? The room fell silent. Students shifted in their seats, eyes flicking between the professor and Barron. A challenge was clear. Barron exhaled slowly, sat up straighter, and met her gaze with no trace of hesitation. Sure, he replied, his voice calm. What would you like to debate, Doctor? Langley? A few students chuckled, sensing the shift in the dynamic. Barron hadn't backed down. Dr. Langley, seeing the opportunity, smiled. Since we're discussing economic policy, she said, let's talk about wealth distribution and the role of government in managing economic inequality. She folded her arms, expecting Barron to defend capitalism and trickle-down economics, topics she had deconstructed countless times on television panels and in books. But Barron didn't flinch. He tilted his head slightly as though amused. You mean the same system that funds institutions like this university? He asked. The same progressive policies that have widened the wealth gap while claiming to promote equity? A few gasps rippled through the class. Even those who disagreed with him had to acknowledge that he wasn't hesitating. Dr. Langley's smile tightened, but this was just the beginning. The tension in the room mounted as students shifted in their seats, sensing that something extraordinary was happening. Dr. Langley had begun debates before, but never like this, never by singling out a student so publicly. She rested her hand on the podium and studied Barron, as if he were an intriguing case study rather than a young man in her class. All right, she said, her voice calm but tinged with curiosity. You seem confident. Tell us then, how exactly has progressive economic policy widened the wealth gap? Barron took his time, adjusting his sleeve before responding. The idea of government intervention to close income gaps sounds noble, he said, his voice steady. But let's look at the data. The war on poverty started in the 1960s. We've spent trillions on social programs, yet wealth inequality has only grown. Why? Because the government isn't solving poverty. It's managing it, keeping people dependent instead of giving them true mobility. A murmur rippled through the room. Some students frowned, others nodded. Dr. Langley smirked. Ah, the classic argument about welfare traps, she said. You're suggesting that without government programs, people would magically lift themselves out of poverty. Barron shrugged. Not magic, just incentive. Look at how regulations crush small businesses, how high corporate taxes push jobs overseas, and how excessive social safety nets discourage personal responsibility. If you make self-sufficiency harder than dependency, what do you think happens? A few students leaned forward, intrigued. Others crossed their arms, preparing to counter. Dr. Langley's fingers curled slightly around the podium, but she kept her smile. And yet, she said, countries with stronger social safety nets, Scandinavian nations, for example, have better quality of life, higher life expectancy, and lower crime rates. Surely you're not suggesting that government assistance is inherently bad. Barron leaned back in his chair, exuding a quiet confidence. The Scandinavian model works because their economies are market-driven, he said. They tax the middle class heavily, not just the rich. They also have fewer regulations on businesses than we do. So if you're advocating for a system like Denmark's, are you also prepared to tell Americans they'll be paying over 50% of their income in taxes? Dr. Langley's smile faltered slightly. She had expected broad ideological arguments, not specifics. A student in the front row turned to his friend. Damn, he came prepared. Dr. Langley drummed her fingers lightly on the podium, but her smile remained. That's a clever way of framing it, Mr. Trump, she said, but you're ignoring the moral obligation of a wealthy nation to support its vulnerable populations? Barron's expression didn't change. I'm not ignoring morality, Doctor. Langley, he said, I'm questioning what actually helps people versus what makes certain politicians feel virtuous. The murmur in the room grew louder. Some students exchanged glances. Others were watching with fascination. Dr. Langley straightened up, deciding to change tactics. All right, she said, her tone sharpening. Let's talk about privilege. You come from wealth. You've never had to struggle for basic necessities. Do you think your perspective might be a little out of touch? It was a calculated strike, something personal meant to put him on the defensive. But Barron didn't blink. Are you suggesting that a person's background disqualifies them from understanding economic principles? He asked, his voice calm, unbothered. If that's the case, should wealthy liberal politicians be dismissed when they advocate for social programs? Or does this standard only apply to people you disagree with? The room fell silent. Dr. Langley's jaw tensed. She was used to rattling opponents, making them falter. But Barron wasn't faltering. He wasn't defensive. He was turning the argument back on her, and for the first time she felt a flicker of uncertainty. But she wasn't ready to concede just yet. The room remained silent, not in boredom, but in recognition of a rare moment, a moment where everyone realized they were witnessing something unforgettable. Dr. Langley wasn't used to this. She had expected Barron to stumble, to lean on tired talking points, to crumble under academic scrutiny. Instead, he was methodical, deliberate, and worst of all, he wasn't intimidated. She shifted her posture, adopting a casual stance, as if her body language might somehow reclaim the authority she felt slipping away. Fine, she said, her voice controlled. Let's step away from economic theory for a moment. Let's talk about democracy itself. Would you agree that an educated, informed population is the foundation of a functioning democracy? Barron nodded slightly. Of course. Good, she continued. Then you must also agree that institutions like universities play a critical role in shaping responsible citizens, by giving them the tools to recognize misinformation and make informed decisions. Barron raised an eyebrow. Universities should be places of learning, yes, he said, but are you suggesting their role is to decide which viewpoints are valid and which aren't? Dr. Langley's lips pressed together. I'm suggesting, she said carefully, that when people, especially those in positions of power, spread falsehoods, it's not just irresponsible, it's dangerous. We have an obligation to protect students from misinformation. Barron tilted his head. Define misinformation, he said simply. A few students smirked, recognizing the tactic. Dr. Langley hesitated for just a moment. Misinformation is deliberately spreading false or misleading information that undermines facts and reality, she said. Barron nodded. So, if someone presents a fact that contradicts a mainstream narrative, and it's later proven true, was it misinformation at the time? Or just inconvenient? Dr. Langley scoffed. That's a false equivalence. Is it? Barron raised an eyebrow. Because history is full of examples where the official truth turned out to be wrong. Galileo was branded a heretic for challenging the scientific consensus of his time. If universities back then had the power to protect students from misinformation, would we still believe the sun revolves around the earth? A murmur rippled through the room. Dr. Langley felt it, the subtle shift in energy, the realization that the conversation was slipping from her grasp. That's an oversimplification, she said quickly. We're not talking about centuries-old debates. We're talking about modern, real-world issues where bad information has real consequences. Take the pandemic, for example. Public trust in science was eroded because of reckless theories that had no basis in reality. Barron didn't flinch. You mean like when officials said vaccines would prevent transmission, but later admitted they were wrong? A few gasps rippled through the room. Dr. Langley felt heat rise in her face. That's not the same thing, she countered. It is, Barron interjected. Science evolves, which means what you call misinformation today might be accepted fact tomorrow. The problem is, once you give institutions the power to control what can and can't be said, who holds them accountable when they're wrong? Silence. Dr. Langley felt the weight of every pair of eyes in the room. She glanced around, searching for a student to defend her position, but none did. Some were processing what had just been said. Others looked outright convinced. And that's when she knew. She was losing. But she wasn't ready to let it end like this. Not yet. Dr. Langley forced a smile, trying to regain control. All right, Barron, she said, forcing a light chuckle. Let's move beyond theory and talk about outcomes. You argue that institutions shouldn't regulate discourse. But what happens when unchecked speech leads to real-world harm? Hate speech, radicalization, conspiracy theories. These aren't just abstract concepts. They influence people's actions. Barron exhaled slowly, calm as ever. I agree that words have consequences, he said smoothly. But suppressing speech has consequences too. When people aren't allowed to challenge ideas openly, it doesn't make those ideas disappear. It just drives them underground, where they grow unchecked and unchallenged. She pursed her lips. So, you're saying we should allow dangerous rhetoric to spread freely? I'm saying that the solution to bad ideas isn't censorship, he replied. It's better arguments. Silencing people doesn't stop extremism. It fuels it. A few students nodded. Others whispered to each other. Dr. Langley felt the momentum slipping. She needed to shift the narrative, so she decided to make it personal. Tell me something, Barron, she said, tilting her head. Do you really believe you'd be making these same arguments if your last name weren't Trump? Or do you just feel the need to defend your father's legacy? The room went still. Barron leaned forward slightly, his expression neutral. But there was a flicker in his eyes. Not anger, but precision. That's an interesting tactic, Professor, he said. If I were losing a debate, I might try to discredit my opponent personally instead of addressing their argument. A sharp intake of breath from the class. Dr. Langley's smile didn't reach her eyes. I'm not discrediting you, she said. I'm asking if your perspective is shaped by privilege rather than experience. Barron didn't hesitate. Let's talk about privilege then, he said, because it sounds like you're implying that only certain people have the right to opinions on these issues. If I weren't a Trump, would my argument suddenly be valid to you? The class was locked in. Some students looked stunned, others were grinning, watching the professor scramble to hold her ground. Dr. Langley exhaled sharply. He had turned her strategy against her. You have a platform most people don't, she pressed. That comes with responsibility. People will listen to you simply because of your name, whether or not what you say is accurate. Barron shot back. Notice how you haven't actually refuted anything I've said. You've just questioned whether I should be saying it at all. More whispers. Dr. Langley had walked right into it. Her throat tightened. She glanced at the clock. 3 minutes left. Well, she said, taking a breath, this has been a spirited discussion. A few students smirked. Others looked at Barron with something new in their eyes. Respect. Dr. Langley forced a smile, but inside she knew. She had underestimated him, and she regretted it. As the class ended, she closed her laptop, signaling the end. No closing remarks, no final counter-argument, just a tight-lipped smile and a glance at the clock, eager to move on. But the students weren't moving. Some lingered, chatting quietly. Others approached Barron, not to argue but to ask questions. Dr. Langley felt it, the shift in the room. For years she had shaped minds in this space. but today she had lost something intangible. She gathered her things quickly, avoiding eye contact as she headed toward the door. But just as she reached it, she heard Barron's voice behind her. "Dr. Langley," he said. She turned, reluctant but unable to ignore him. "Thank you for the discussion," he said simply. "I enjoyed it." No sarcasm, no smugness, just genuine sincerity. Dr. Langley nodded, muttering something polite before stepping into the hallway. The moment the door closed behind her, she exhaled slowly. She had thought today would be an easy win, but instead she realized she was the one being taught.